Welcome to the live stream about Fluent Validation. So I'm a developer at Microsoft. My name is Rehan, and tonight we're going to look at a real world use case for Fluent Validation, and we're going to dig right in. We're going to look at how we can validate fairly complex objects with deep hierarchies. We want to check that properties are not empty, not null, in between certain ranges, and all kinds of other bits and bobs. So we're just going to dig right in, and we'll switch over here to my desktop. This is the Fluent Validation website, and it gives you an idea of what we're going to be doing. So this is creating a validator object. In this case, it's validating a customer object, and we specify a bunch of rules for the customer object and its various properties. And once you've done that, you can use this to validate the object itself. So we're gonna switch over to actual code now, Visual Studio. This is the object that I want to validate, this configuration object here. It doesn't really matter what it's used for this live stream, but I do other live streams around creating a Kubernetes cluster using Pulumi, and this is the configuration for that. And I want to be able to validate this object. It's got a bunch of strings, collections. It's got nested objects over here, and there you go. The hierarchy goes deeper and deeper, and there's a bunch of different types. There's enums, integers, strings, all kinds of things that I would like to validate. So let's dig right in and start with adding the package. So there's a Fluent Validation package that we need to add to start with. Validation, and I tend to use this view, but it doesn't always give me the intelligence I need. 10.4.0 10.4.0 I think it's quicker than using the UI, specifying a NuGet package like this. And we'll now create so I have some notes over here of what we need to do. And we're going to create some validators. So we'll need a folder for these validators that we're going to create. We'll create that. And all the objects that we want to validate are in this configuration folder. And the first one we're going to create is called a configuration validator. So the classes that we're creating are going to mirror the models that we want to validate. So the first model we want to validate is this configuration class. So I'm just going to call it configuration validator, and this will be a public class, and it will implement abstract validator, bring in Fluent Validation, and it's going to validate the configuration class. Why can't I? Doesn't seem to be able to find. Sometimes I'm having some trouble with Visual Studio picking up types in my name, in my project. Not sure why that is, but we got there in the end. And we'll need a constructor. This is where we specify all the rules. And if we look at our object over here, maybe we can just stick it on the side here. We've got an application name here, so that you can specify rules by doing rule for, and then you do a lambda to specify which property you want to create a rule for. And then we want to say not null. We don't want this to be null, and not empty. Now, there doesn't seem to be a rule for not null and empty. And we also want to add this dot because I'm using style cop. And I'm just going to move this over here a little bit more. So we want to copy this and create another rule for the environment name. What other rules are there in here? Let's have a quick look at these. So we have a credit card, configure, email address. We can specify that something's empty. It's between some values. This is for collection, so we can iterate over collections. Something is greater than, in between is an enum. We're gonna use this one in a second. It has a certain length, is less than a certain value. Maximum length must, we'll have a look at that in a moment. And when with name, so the with properties are interesting. They add some extra options that you can set for the rule. So with error code, with message, with name, with severity, with state. Don't really particularly need many of those. Those are for more advanced scenarios. And then we also have a property here called common location. I pretty much want to check not null and not empty for all the strings, but I also, in this particular case, want to check for an additional scenario. So I'm just gonna go like this and say x dot common location, and I want it to be dot contains. So I want this value to be contained within one of, so I have a bunch of Azure locations here, and these are just a list of strings. They look a bit like this. They're read from a JSON file actually, and I just want to make sure that this location is within that list of valid locations. And I wonder what this error is all about. Common location is not null here. String does not contain a definition for common location and no access. Why is that? Dot common location. It seems to be happy with it, IntelliSense wise, but compiler wise, it's giving me an error. That's a bit strange. Are you missing a using directive or an assembly reference? No. So the must function has to return, just looking at my notes here, a Boolean value, and it takes a string. Okay. Let's pull this out. Must be within, must be an Azure location. Generate method, and we'll just call this location, this argument here, and we'll just say that, and we don't need that, of course. Must be an Azure location, so that I just need to add this dot there, and we're done. Okay, cool. So we can move on. I also have a collection here of locations. So this is the same scenario, common location, location. So this is a collection of Azure locations now, and that needs to be treated slightly differently. So this dot rule for, first of all, we need to make sure that it's not null, dot not null, and then there's a for each function. Now there is a separate for each function, rule for each, and you can say locations dot must, and this must be an Azure location. So that just makes sure that each of these locations it's x dot, missed the x dot. Each of these locations in the collection must be an Azure location, so it's calling this function down here for us for each of those. But I think you can just do for each directly here, and I'm not sure what the scenario here is. Oops. So X here is rule builder collection. Oh, it's some sort of rule building thing. So I guess this is where you say must, and then you can say must be in an Azure location. So this is how you could chain it into one long line. I think that looks okay. The next one here is actually a sub object. So this Kubernetes property here, this is another class, and we actually need to create a validator separately for this class. So we're going to do that next, and we'll create another abstract validator class. We'll just call it Kubernetes cluster validator. And we'll bring that class over to this window, and we'll call that abstract validator. We'll create the constructor, we'll get rid of these extra using statements, and we're ready to validate this thing. But we need to deal with it here first. So this dot rule for x dot Kubernetes. First of all, it can't be null, that object, and second of all, we want to set a validator to go and run against that object. So we're going to pass in that new type name we created. Kubernetes cluster validator, and I think oh, we need to new one up here as well. We need to actually pass it in. So I'm just going to do that, and that should work, I think. Cannot convert from Kubernetes cluster validator to func. Oh, okay. So we have to, is it something like that? And we no longer need this because it's C# is clever enough to know what type, generic type that was. So we can just remove that. So this is, for this property now, it's gonna check that it's not null. And if it's not null, it'll go and run this validator against that object to make sure all is good. So we can go and look at that object now. So we'll go over here, we'll do control dot on that and have a look at this object. So this object is a bit more complicated. It's got another property here, a collection of objects. So that's interesting. We've got an enum here. We've got another enum, another collection of objects, and another couple of enums. So we'll start with maybe the enum. So one thing that people don't often realize is that when you have enums, so like this one, so you can specify a value, but what you can also do is say any old random number and cast it to an enum, and that's, you can pass that in. So you do need to validate that enums have been passed, have the correct integer value. So Fluent Validation has actually got something to help with that. So we're going to do rule for x.skewtier.enum is an enum, and I'm not sure what I need to pass here. Is it just a generic argument here? Whoops. Like this. And I forgot this dot. And let's just check that I've got that right. Can I? It's not going to let me control click on it right now. Oops. Just going to have a quick look over here. Nope. I think that's it. Oh, use it. Oh, this was correct. It's asking me to use an expression body, and if I do that, it will work. It will go green. Cool. So this checks to make sure that the value in this property is actually one of the ones in the enum and not just some random integer. And I'll do that for each of the enum properties, but let's dig into this other sub property here. So IEnumerable of this object. When you have an IEnumerable of object, x dot, what is this, maintenance. I want to make sure it's not null. And then I want to run a for each again, like we did before. And I want to set the validator that we're going to use here this time. And I want to create a new validator. So we're going to create one more validator here. And we'll create that class right now. We've got other properties in here, but maybe I'll do them off screen, because those are just a bit repetitive then at that point. But this has some interesting things in it that we can validate. So I'm gonna take a look at this one. So this is another abstract validator, and this is of type this guy, and CTOR tab to get the constructor, and then we can do this dot rule for, and this has a couple of properties. The one is a collection of days. So this is going to be not null, and dot for each x dot is an enum. So it's just a collection of, let's go and have a look at the type. It's a collection of day of week. This is actually in the system dot namespace. You can see some of the values here, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. You get the idea. So we just want to make sure that we have valid days of the week. And the other property is a collection of integers, hour slots. So for that one, I think rule for hour slots, we want to make sure it's not null first of all, and we want to run a for each on it, and we want to say is in range. I think we want to say it's between some certain values. So the first value is 0 and 24. So there's 24 hours in a day, and we want to say that each of these hour slots has to be one of those values between 0 and 24. And that should give us the validation for that entire object. So if I hit save, we have now that validated. Shall we look at one more maybe? If I go here again, there is a collection of node pools. There is some values here. There is yeah, let's do that one as well. So in this node pool object, I have something else I want to validate. So let's go over there. This dot rule for x dot. This is my node pools, and I want to make sure it's not null, as it's a collection of these node pool objects. And I want to run for each set validator new Kubernetes node pool validator, and we'll set that class up next. Can I just generate that type in a new file? Awesome. Oh, well, what kind of type has that generated? Strange. We want an abstract validator of that type, and we can get rid of these other namespaces. That's public. Oh, capital P. It's not Visual Basic here. We're going to tab, get that, and then this dot. Let's validate a couple of these things in here. So the first First one is we have a value here for the maximum. Let's just do these three here. So the first one, what we'll do is maximum surge. So that needs a regular expression. This dot rule for maximum surge dot, and I think that's matches, and we can pass in a regular expression here. Now I don't have that regular expression to hand. Maybe if I can quickly pull it out. Here it is. I want to stick that regular expression in there. Don't tell me what it means off the top of my head. I think that means the start of the line. That's the end. This is one or more numbers or digits followed by a percentage character, and that's optional. So what this is saying is this can either be a number or a number followed by the percentage sign. So that's a regular expression. And then we also want rule for maximum node count dot less than or equal to, and I think that the maximum node count can be 100, and we also have minimum node count, minimum node count, and the minimum can be 0. So the value has to be between 0 and 100, and we also need to make sure that the maximum is always more than the minimum, more than or equal to the minimum. How do we do that? So we need to kind of link two properties together here, which should be interesting. How do we do that? Let's have a look. We'll do that on a new line. So dot how do we do this? Is there some way of saying less than? You can do an expression. Less than the maximum node count. Okay. Less than or equal to the maximum node count. And I guess we could do a corresponding one here. This has to be more than or greater than or equal to the minimum node count. And there's these two rules. If one of them fails, the other will fail as well. But that may not be a bad thing, and we'll comment to why next. So we have our validators. We've got other objects here that we can validate, but I'm not going to go into those. Those are kind of just repetitions of what we've already done. So let's actually execute our validator. So we have a new configuration object here, and I believe I can just new up a validator and call validate on it. So there's a few different functions here. You've got the async versions. You've got a validate and throw, which will validate the object and throw an exception if it's invalid. I don't quite want that, so I'm just going to hit validate and pass in my configuration instance. And then that gives us our validation result. So if we go and have a look at that type, it's got a few bits and bobs on it. So it's got an is valid. That's pretty important. It's got the number of errors, and the rules that were executed, and a toString function, which is going to give us a new line separated new line separated string containing all our errors, and that's actually what I want. Oh, this is I configuration, isn't it? Okay, I wonder if I can change this configuration validator to an I configuration validator. That still works. So this type is I configuration, so that still works. And then next, what I want to do is I want to log an error, and this is Pulumi code, so you don't really need to know about this, but it's used a bit like console or write line, but for Pulumi. And I'm just going to call toString on it to see what gets output. And then I want to throw an exception if it's invalid. Oh, I only want to log this error if validation result.isValid. If it's invalid, log an error, and then can I throw an exception based on this? I don't think I can. So I think what I would have to do is call validate and throw. Validate and throw async. It's a bit of a shame that I can't check is valid, check the result, log something out, and then throw. But I'll live with that. I wonder if I validate and throw. Yeah. So we'll try that out now. And if I want to run a Pulumi program, not necessarily for a I'm going to create something invalid to start with. This is not necessary for this particular stream, but I'm just going to create an invalid value here. So I'm going to create, let's say, a maximum node count that's let's say 200, because that's more than 100, and the minimum node count is going to be 300 because that's more than the maximum. That should create an error for us, and we'll see what happens when we create that, when we execute this code. So this is this command, if you're using Pulumi, just builds the code and tries to deploy it to Azure. Not, as I say, not necessary for this particular stream, but this is going to execute our code, and hopefully it will log our error over here, and we'll see that appearing on the screen any second now. I think I covered nearly all of the major validations that are inbuilt into Fluent Validation. Very, very powerful. You can also do custom validators. I think you have to implement a particular interface or type for that, and you can plug in those custom validators. Once you do that, let's have a look at this. Come on. Any second now. Here we go. So we got our error. The specified condition was not met for common location. It's interesting that what it's done here with the property. Okay, so this is interesting. Let's go back and look at our type. So for common location, we actually set this guy, North Europe. And if we go and look at our configuration validator, the locations in here are basically coming from this JSON file. So it looks like it's just it's taken this name, stuck a space in here, and we also should, if we do with message, that should give this condition here a better error message than the one shown here, where it just says the specified condition was not met, because it doesn't know what code we've written here in this function. Must be an Azure location. So there's that. And then the specified condition was not met for locations as well. So that's interesting. We could give that a custom message. Maximum node count must be less than or equal to 100, and then must be greater than or equal to 300. And you have a bunch of errors here. I think I got one of these wrong actually. If I go back to my node pool validator, oh, it has to be greater than or equal to 0. So that's why we got a few more errors there than normal. So here I need to say what's the sort of standard language that they use here. Must be, so they say, and I think there's a syntax to this. So if we go back to the documentation here, chaining validators, custom messages. Where's the bit about custom messages? Built-in custom error codes, overriding the message. Here we go. With message, and here we go. This is what we want, property name. So you can take the property name here. So this gets replaced at runtime. Must be an Azure location. And do they end with full stops? They do. And I think there's other things we can plug in here, including the property value, which would be super useful. With value, property value must be an Azure location. So we could stick that in, and in fact we could probably pull this out into a const string Azure location message. And now I can stick that in here for each of these locations here. So if I run that one more time, it should give me this custom message. It should say something like common space location with value, and then whatever the value was that I passed in must be an Azure location. I'm not sure if it adds the single quotes around the values for us, or if we have to do that ourselves. Let's find out. It's running now. If we go back to the documentation, there's other things we can do as well. There's other replacements for the minimum length, the maximum length, the total length if you're using the length validator. If you're using the comparison validators, one of these ones, you have this comparison value, and so on and so forth. Overriding the property name. So you can change the property name. Not sure why you'd want to do that. Conditions. You can also specify when you want that particular validator to run using this when command. So let's see, what did this give us? Common location with value North Europe must be an Azure location, and that is an Azure location. For some reason it's not. Maybe the collection's empty for some reason. I'll have a look at that later. But that's really nice. It hasn't put the single quotes, so that's something that, to match up with the validators that it provides, I would probably add those myself. And that's a quick guide to running validators with Fluent Validation and getting your objects validated and managing to get your properties and validated, making sure that they have all the correct values before you can continue. Be sure to check out the next stream. We're going to continue with this code and talk about deploying an Azure Kubernetes cluster using Pulumi, and in particular we're going to look at creating a private cluster for better security, so it's not accessible on the web, and that's the default position of Azure Kubernetes service, where anyone can just come on and try to hack it. So we'll look at that, and do like and subscribe, and if it really helps the channel out. And if you want to have a chat with me, you can ping me on Twitter or on my blog at rehanse.com. Thanks for watching, everyone.